Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Pat Murphy, Head of Environment Knowledge Transfer. And this morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sinead McCarthy. Sinead is a public health and nutrition researcher based at Ashtown in Dublin. And you're going to be talking to us about sustainable diets and balancing personal and planetary health. This has been a big issue in the public domain over the last number of years.
It is, and it's constantly in the public domain. Even so much this week, the COP26. I avoided going there just to present here this morning, Pat.
Oh, very good, very good. We're honoured.
So it's constantly there. The dairy companies earlier in the week, I think, were meeting to sign agreement on methane emissions, and so everything we do in our daily lives has a climatic impact, and food is one of the aspects that really receives a lot of significant focus as well.
But there's the other side of it, and the other side is what is best for us as humans in terms of our health, our well-being, and our longevity, if you want.
Yeah, so it's not, I suppose the message that I'll try and communicate today, it's not just as simple as an easy swap. It's if you go from a high carbon food to a low carbon food, it might be more sustainable, but it isn't necessarily more healthy from a nutrition and nutrient perspective.
Okay, and I suppose what we're looking forward to from you is a very balanced discussion on it, because some of the discussions in this space can be very much to one extreme or another.
Yeah, and all of the work that I'm presenting today, I've brought it down into a simple format, but it all comes from published research that I've been working in with other colleagues across Ireland from the universities outside of Teagasc. So this is peer-reviewed research, and it wouldn't get out there unless it was, unbiased and balanced as well.
Very good. I'm also delighted to be joined by Seamus Kearney. Seamus, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Pat.
You'll be helping with questions later on. So, Sinead, without further ado then, if you would share your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Million. And thanks for the introduction, Pat. And thank you for the invitation to present to this group today. So over the next half hour or so, I'm going to bring you through some of the research that I've been working on for the last 5 to 6 years, and trying to get that balance right between the nutrients and food that we need for our personal health, but also then how do we balance out the carbon footprint and the climatic impact and the planetary health of the foods we consume. So it's a bit of a battle trying to just get that scales in balance there between both sustainability and health. When I talk about carbon footprint of foods throughout the session, this is what I'm referring to essentially, that the carbon footprint is the total amount of greenhouse gases associated with producing that food and consuming that food. We often see that plant-based foods like your carrots have a low carbon footprint, and then as we move up the scale of carbon footprint, we find the higher carbon footprint foods like red meat at the top. There are lots of other metrics in terms of sustainability of food, from land use and water footprint as well, that I'm not going to go into today. Today's talk will just focus on the carbon footprint, but ideally you do combine all of the different metrics. So to begin with, the Irish diet, the average consumer from all of the foods that we eat generates about 6.5 kilos of carbon per day arising from the foods that we consume. And you'll see this blue cloud with carbon coming up every so often, and it's the carbon footprint that I'm referring to here. To give a little bit of context, we often hear that food and agriculture and the production of food accounts for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And in some respects, that's not surprising, because we have to eat food. It's one of the activities that we do every day that we absolutely have to engage in. And we can't, harking back to COVID days, we could happily not travel. We could happily stay within a 2 or 3 person bubble, a 5K limit. But we always had to get to the shops and get our food. So it's one of the activities for survival, we have to engage in. So to just give a little bit of context to food and carbon footprint, I want to talk for just a moment about the carbon footprint of everyday activities other than food consumption that we actually engage in. So what does 3 kilos of carbon footprint look like, or 3 kilos of what do we do that generates 3 kilos of footprint? So here's the moment. And there's my dog, Molly the collie. And Molly is a fantastic, loyal friend in my household. And to feed Molly each day costs about 3 kilos of carbon in terms of the pet food that she consumes. She's purely just here for pleasure, a bit of a watchdog, and she brings me out for long walks at the weekend. So there's a healthy aspect to her. But otherwise, there's not really very much we're getting for that 3 kilo cost per day. For those of you who like to stream your movies online on whatever streaming device that you use, approximately an hour and a half movie, or 2 hours of a movie, will also generate about 3 kilos of emissions. So that's in terms of the data centers packaging that quality data into a movie that has to be delivered with sound and everything to your TV or device. And then your average spaghetti bolognese or portion of beef bolognese is also 3 kilos. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we have to consume this piece. The other two activities really of what we engage in over the course of a day aren't essential activities. So we need to put that emphasis back on food being an essential carbon cost, if you like, but we still need to produce it sustainably. So getting into food-based dietary guidelines to begin with, how do we get the balance right of the foods that we eat, that they'll keep our body healthy, but also that we maintain the health of the planet at the same time? So just to start very quickly with an introduction to healthy eating, if you like, and the evolution of dietary guidelines. So we need to eat a healthy diet that's rich in fruit and veg, that cover the rainbow. You're often told to eat the rainbow, and that's because of the phytochemicals that are present in fruit and veg, like carotenoids. These carotenoids are essential in our diet. They're one of the many benefits of consuming fruit and veg. When we consume them, they go through our system into our bloodstream, and essentially they mop up the bad cholesterol that we hear about, LDL. They help promote a high level of good cholesterol in our bloodstreams. And when we consume a high level of fruit and veg, it helps to keep our arteries clean, if you like. So we don't see the deposits here in the arteries that increase our risk of heart disease and increase our risk of stroke and so on. So that's one of the many reasons why we need to eat a healthy diet. And it's why our fruit and veg is at the bottom of the food pyramid in terms of eating a high amount of it. But in terms of communicating how much you should eat and the quantity and quality of foods that you should eat, what we use are food-based dietary guidelines. And these, if anybody wants to find out more about it, just look it up through the FAO. And they have great detail on that there. And you'll find that there's about 100 countries globally have their own national food-based dietary guidelines. It's depicted as a graphical image here, like a plate or a pyramid, and the food pyramid as we have here in Ireland. And what it's essentially communicating is all of these essential nutrients that we have to eat, the foods that these essential nutrients come from. So rather than you thinking on a daily basis, where am I going to get my iron from today, and what food do I eat to get that, and how much of it will I need? If we follow these guidelines, we'll essentially get that right without having to think specifically about the actual nutrients we need to get. So how do we do the same for a healthy planet? So in 2011, the FAO provided a definition of what a sustainable diet was, and started to recognize that combination of what we eat and its impact on the planet. And they define a sustainable diet as being protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. So if we grow monocultures, that's not going to be respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. It has to be culturally acceptable. So foods that will work here may not work in other countries on other continents across the world. And similarly, foods there may not work here. We don't know how to cook with them. We don't know what to serve with them. So it's hard to make maybe a culturally accessible, healthy and tasty meal with foods we're not familiar with. Accessible, economically fair and affordable. So it's not right if one family can afford to eat a healthy and sustainable diet and another family cannot. It has to be there for all. And we kind of generally take it as a given, certainly in Western cultures, that our food is safe to eat. So when you go into the supermarket and you buy your food and consume it and make it into a meal afterwards, for the most part, you take it as a given that it's safe and healthy. But all of these factors have to come into a sustainable diet. So it's a lot of elements to get right. So if we take these elements of what a sustainable diet is, similar to our nutrients, overlay it with some kind of food-based graphical guideline, how do we get to guidelines that are both sustainable and healthy, that protects us as the current generation and the future generations to come on the planet as well? So it's quite a massive challenge. And I've literally dipped my toe probably in the water of that challenge as well. So what do sustainable and healthy dietary guidelines look like? There has been lots proposed that have been met with both positive and negative opinions. The most popular one here on the left of my screen is probably the Eat Lancet report. And the Eat Lancet very much, I suppose, shook up the whole debate on diet and sustainability and got a lot more people talking about it. There are elements of it that are very good. There are elements of it that I feel is very restricted. There's one aspect, it's 60 grams of potato a day is the maximum that they recommend, which is one of your baby potatoes, if you like, or a potato the size of an egg. Now, I'm not sure how many people would eat potatoes that are that low, and they recommend consuming rice. But the rice has to travel 4,000 miles to Ireland for us to consume it, whereas we can grow the potatoes in our back garden or even on our balconies. And the carbon footprint of both foods is very similar as well. So some recommendations in there are good, but it's next to impossible to provide a global set of recommendations because they won't have that economically fair or that accessible and culturally appropriate piece for everybody. More recently, earlier in the summer this year, the Climate and Health Alliance in Ireland launched their report called Fixing Food Together, Transitioning to a More Healthy and Sustainable Food System. And it's a very good report. If you Google it, you can download it from their website. And it's quite similar to what our current healthy eating guidelines are, with some layers of sustainability coming into it as well. So where this journey, if you like, for me began was looking at the Irish food consumption data, national data set for the Irish population, and to try and see what foods are people eating or what patterns of food are people consuming, and is it sustainable or not? And this work started and was published along with my colleagues back in 2017. So just very briefly to give you a little bit of background to the National Food Consumption Survey and the data I would have been working with, if anybody here was a participant in the survey, you would have filled out a diary like this for every single meal that you consumed. And it wasn't just a tea and cheese sandwich for lunch that you had, but it even went into the detail of whether it was brown or white, whether you had butter or margarine, what kind of milk you had in your sandwich or in your tea rather, and then the cheese that you had in your sandwich. So very specific, very detailed intake data. It's, if you could describe this survey as a car, you would say it was a Rolls Royce. It is one of the best surveys and data collection methods that's carried out across Europe, and it's recognized for its detail and its quality. So for the survey, there was 1,500 people completed this diary over 4 days. And then we want to take all of these foods and look at them from an intake and a composition perspective. So when we're looking at the nutrient composition of foods, we use this book that's known as McCann-Widdowson Composition of Foods, and it is the go-to verifiable resource for nutrient analysis. And it'll be comparable to other continents as well. So if you look at 100 grams of red meat from the composition of foods here, or you look at it from the USDA data in America, you will see very, very similar nutrient analysis. So the data entry software that we use takes all of the food diaries, applies the nutrient composition database to it, and we get a file afterwards that has all of the food intake for every day of their recording, and the analysis of every food they ate at every meal over the 4 days. So it's a very detailed, very thorough database. So what I did then was I took this database with the food and nutrient work in it, and then applied a nutrient or a carbon conversion factor to all of the foods. Now, as I just mentioned in the last slide, that McCann-Widdowson work is very thorough, very detailed, and you can absolutely stand over the values that are used for each of the foods. But when it comes to carbon emissions of foods, it's much more difficult. And to give you an example, for the work here, we used some UK data and applied a carbon conversion factor of 35 kilos of CO2 per kilo of beef. But when you go to the published literature, that can sometimes be presented as low as 20 kilos or it can be as high as 70 kilos. So the variation in the carbon footprint of foods varies greatly and isn't as reliable as the nutrient analysis that we get. So you just have to work with the best data available to you at the time. So we took all of the foods that were consumed, applied a conversion factor to them. And you can see as we go from the more plant-based to the animal-based foods that the carbon footprint goes up. And then we looked at the patterns of consumption. So are there patterns of carbon footprint associated with the foods, better, healthier, more sustainable and less sustainable? And we applied statistical analysis to look at the data in this way. So when we did this, we came up with 3 distinct patterns. And just before I show the patterns here, the point I want to make is the type of analysis we use lets the data define the groups. So normally you might say, I want to look at men and women separately, or higher social class and lower social class separately. And you're telling the software package, if you like, to split the groups based on these categories. But when we use cluster analysis, the data itself defines the clusters and says all of these people are similar based on these characteristics. And this group over here, all of those people within that group are similar based on a set of characteristics, but the 2 groups are very different from each other. So when we did this based on the carbon footprint we were getting from the foods we consumed, there was 3 very distinct patterns identified in the Irish diet. The first one was what we called an unsustainable group, and that was about 25% of the population. They had high intake of processed meats, high intake of your savory snacks like your crisps and so on, and high intake of alcohol. They were more likely to be men and younger age group as well. Again, another approximately quarter of the population were what we call the nutritionally sustainable group. They had the highest fruit and veg consumption and in the diet. They had the highest fish consumption. They had the lowest red meat consumption, but they also had the highest dairy food consumption as well. These were meeting the most of the dietary guidelines in terms of BMI, weight, fruit and veg intake, nutrient intake, and so on. Whereas the unsustainable group were unsustainable both from a carbon footprint perspective, but also from a health perspective. They weren't meeting as many dietary guidelines. Then the third group was about half of the population, and we termed these the culturally sustainable group because it kind of reflected that cultural piece within the Irish context. Your meat and 2 veg consumer, very much, if you like. They had the highest red meat consumption of the 3 groups. They had a moderate amount of dairy consumption, higher than the unsustainable group, but slightly lower than this nutritionally sustainable group. And they had the highest consumption of starchy staples, so your pasta, your rice, your potatoes, and so on. And that was approximately half of the population. They tended to be slightly older, again, more females in this group. And while they met more dietary guidelines than the unsustainable group, they weren't just as healthy as the nutritional sustainable. Now, if I was a betting person, I would have said this group with the highest red meat consumption are probably have the highest carbon footprint. And I was actually proven wrong. What we found was that the highest carbon footprint was in this unsustainable group. So they were generating the male values are on top here. So the men were generating about 9 kilos of carbon per day, while women were generating 6 kilos of carbon per day in this group. In the nutritionally sustainable group, it was 7.7 for the men and 5 for the women, and then slightly lower in the men for this group. So although they had the highest red meat consumption, their overall carbon footprint of the pattern of foods they were consuming, not necessarily any one specific food, but the pattern of foods that they're consuming generates a very similar carbon footprint to that of the nutritionally sustainable. So in terms of an Irish context, you want to get somewhere in between the 2 of these groups where these are staying very healthy in terms of being nutritionally sustainable and a good carbon footprint. This group has a good carbon footprint, but we maybe want to get them aligned with more nutrient and nutritional guidelines as well. But it was certainly a surprising finding. the alcohol here and savory snacks, these discretionary foods as they're known, they make a huge contribution to carbon footprint in the diet, and yet they're probably the least mentioned food when we hear the debate that's going on around carbon footprint and planetary health. So, can we develop a set of guidelines that might work, that'll address both that healthy body piece and the healthy planet bit? And if you think of it, sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes we're doing something already and it might need a little bit of tweaking. And from that perspective, then I thought, let's take the food pyramid. We're familiar with it for about it. It's been used in Ireland for over 30 years now. When the food pyramid was first launched, there wasn't a mention of dietary sustainability. Acid rain was the environmental concern of the day. So I started off with the objective that if we were to follow the guidelines on the food pyramid and something we're familiar with already, would that also be a more sustainable diet? So taking the food pyramid layer by layer, and if we start with the fruit and vegetables at the bottom, and I showed you at the start of the presentation why it's important to eat fruit and veg, and I'll put my hand up and say I'm guilty of not achieving the 5 to 7 servings a day, but it's something that I cannot emphasize how healthy fruit and veg are and how good they are for you in the diet. But as a population, the average consumption is too low. We're eating less than 200 grams, which is about 2.5 portions of fruit and veg a day. So we're less than half of our requirement. When it comes to the whole meal cereals and dairy foods, we're just about right with the amount that we're consuming. We could probably do it going a bit more on the whole meal side, but in terms of the overall amount, we're kind of getting it just about right. Similarly with milk, yogurt and cheese, our intake is approximately within recommendations. When we get to the protein shelf, we find that we're eating too much from this shelf, a little bit too much. We're not exceptionally out of balance, but we could do with tightening in on that shelf. Fats and oils, again, are okay. And then we get up to the treat shelf. Now, the treat recommendation is not every day, maximum once or twice a week. So it's not once or twice a day, but that much over the case of a week or the length of a week. We're eating over 600 grams of fruit and veg, we're eating over 600 grams from this top shelf of the food pyramid every single day. We're eating 2 to 3 times more treat foods than we are fruit and veg there at the bottom of the shelf. So the pyramid is a very solid structure. They've survived in Egypt for years, and that's why it's used as a graphical communication for the balance of foods that we eat. And we can see when we just take out the food pyramid in the background, we're completely out of kilter. It's not a solid structure and it's going to collapse on us. So we need to refine where we are in terms of achieving our healthy guidelines. Now, if we followed the food pyramid guidelines, increased our fruit and veg, brought our meat intake to within what the recommendations are, and halved our discretionary food consumption. Now, even at having our discretionary food consumption, we're going to be outside the guidelines for discretionary foods, but it's a starting point. It's easier to reduce than completely eliminate. So we can see here the light green or mustard colored line is what we're currently eating. We need to have it to get down to somewhere that might approximate recommendations. And then we need to decrease our meat intake by about a portion a day, and that'll bring us down to within recommended intakes. We need to increase our fruit and veg. We need to more than double it. We're only about 200 grams per day, and ideally we'd like to be over 500 grams a day when it comes to fruit and veg. What that'll look like then from the carbon footprint is we can have the carbon footprint coming from our discretionary foods. And you can see here that we have about 2 kilos of carbon footprint coming from these discretionary foods. So we can bring that down to under 1 kilo if we have it. If we reduce our meat by 1 portion, again, we can bring down the carbon footprint associated with the protein shelf. But we need to dramatically increase our fruit and veg, and there will be an associated increase in fruit and veg carbon footprint by virtue of increasing the food. But these changes combined can save us about 1.6 kilos of carbon a day, which may not sound an awful lot, but if you add that up to 365 days a year and we all eat that bit healthier every day, you're saving approximately a transatlantic flight over the course of a year. Now, whether you decide to bank that or spend it on your transatlantic flight, I leave it up to you. But not only are we getting that saving in planetary health, but there's the public health saving that we'll get as well. If we're following the healthy eating guidelines, we're going to have less non-communicable diseases rather, that's associated with an unhealthy diet like heart disease, obesity, and so on. So it's a win-win situation, both for the planet, for our personal health, and even the economic health of the country, because there's less expenditure then on healthcare if we're being more healthy as well. So that's the what we are doing. How do we actually do it then? And the guidelines are actually quite simple. You try to incorporate fruit and veg into every single meal that you can. So have at least half of your plate as vegetables. Add in lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet corn into your sandwich. Don't just have the meat. Snack on the healthy foods like apples, grapes. They're really easy and convenient. You can put them in your handbag, your school bag, your rucksack, and bring them to work with you, and you have it there, rather than maybe reaching for the unhealthy snack. Juice we can only have once a day. So if you drink the litre of juice with breakfast, it still only counts for one portion of fruit and veg a day. And then having stir fries for dinners. They're just easy ways to increase the fruit and veg. If we think about meat, you have your two hands, and approximately 2 palms of your hands per day is the amount of meat that you should be consuming. So that depends on how big your palm is as well. And then for treats, to keep it to the 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Saturdays and Sundays, definitely not today and tomorrow. So just maintain the 2 days a week if possible with the treats, and easier said than done. So going back to that 1.5 kilos that I just mentioned there that we'd save if we were to follow healthy dietary guidelines, that's one approach to being more sustainable, more balanced. There's a lot of approaches mentioned elsewhere as well. And there's one aspect of this I just want to speak about for the next minute or two. And so should we change the food that we're eating, or should we change how it's produced, and what impact would that have? And it's very easy to say completely eliminate all of the animal protein foods in your diet, replace them with plant foods, and you'll get a saving in carbon footprint. But realistically, how easy is that to implement? Are people going to do it? Changing consumer behavior is like turning a ship. It's very slow and a very difficult thing to do. So what might be the best approach, and what savings are we going to get if we take that approach? So I took the food consumption data and had a wee look with it to see if we could produce our food more sustainably. So before the food leaves the farm, you're looking at about 80 to 85% of the carbon footprint associated with that food happens on the farm. So can we produce it more sustainably? So as a consumer, when I have the food on my plate for dinner here this evening, I don't necessarily have to worry about the carbon footprint of it because I know it has been produced very sustainably. So I've just explored some of those ideas. So if we were to, the first scenario, take all of the red meat out of the diet because it's the highest carbon footprint and replace it with legumes. If we replace maybe half of the red meat with half legumes, keep the diet the same, but edit or modify how it's produced. So if beef or red meat could be reduced by 25% of its carbon footprint by virtue of implementing more sustainable practices at farm level. And I appreciate that comes with its own difficulties and complications, but this is just a scenario kind of discussion. If we keep the diet the same, but reduce the carbon footprint associated with producing beef by 30%, keep the diet the same, but reduce the carbon footprint by 50%. And this is kind of how it looks. And what you see, this 1.6 is coming up again. So if we were to follow a healthy diet, we can reduce our carbon footprint by 1.6 kilos a day. If we were to replace all of the red meat in our diet, so we now eat no more red meat, replace the amount of red meat we currently consume with legumes, we would save about 1.5 kilos or 1.6 kilos of red meat. Now we can achieve the same by just being balanced in terms of how we eat. If we do a 50-50 mix of legumes and red meat, you'll see we're still getting about 800 grams of carbon per day from red meat, and we get about a 12% reduction, or nearly 1 kilo per day reduction in carbon footprint. And then similarly, if we leave our diet the same, but start to improve the sustainability elements of how our food is produced, we can also get reductions in the carbon footprint of our food. So if we could reduce the carbon footprint associated with producing red meat, and that's only one food we're changing in the diet, we could get up to 12% reduction in the carbon footprint of our diet by changing how we produce it and not changing our consumption patterns. So it's just, I'm not sure if my ticker here is actually, they're an awful nuisance when they're in the way. It's just showing there's a number of ways you can approach a sustainable diet. It doesn't necessarily have to go down the entirely plant-based route. That even just eating a healthy balance of what we're already doing, which might be a little bit easier, can achieve the same differences as moving into completely changing or completely eliminating foods that we are eating. So to just take this a little bit further and look at foods that we eat every day. I love to cook. It's my go-to thing at the weekend. I like to explore recipes and see what I can make for dinner. Now, I'm not going to claim to be a master chef, but there's nobody hasn't come back for dinner again, and usually it's met with success in the household. So here's one idea in terms of how to plan a meal, serve your dinner with a side of sustainability, an extra helping of health, and not cost the earth, literally and metaphorically. This is one of my go-to recipes for during the week. It's easy and convenient, and we'll feed plenty and some left over for the freezer as well. The particular recipe book I use, this is the exact recipe that's in the book for the bolognese, 800 grams of beef and some other ingredients, and its recommendation is that it serves 8 people. When I apply the conversion factors I mentioned earlier to each of these ingredients, add it up, we get about 30 kilos in total for this 8-portion bolognese. And if you do an online shop, I popped all of the ingredients into one of the online retailers, and it was going to cost me €12.83 to buy all the ingredients for this meal. If we looked at per serving, the recipe recommends 8 servings. We get 3.7 kilos per serving of CO2 associated with this dish. We have about $160 per person it's going to cost to prepare each meal. But we get about, this is my fruit and vegometer here, we get about 1 serving of fruit and veg in this meal. If we change it up slightly and add in, first of all, starting with the beef mince here, if we reduce that to 750 grams from the original 800 and now serve 10 people, that's within that 75 gram recommendation portion that we saw on the health eating guidelines earlier. If we take some extra fruit and veg, and this is what will bulk it out, this is what turns it from an 8-portion dish into a 10-portion dish, add that into the bolognese. We now get, for all of these ingredients, we still have 30 kilos of CO2. So we haven't gone up in carbon. Our price has gone up very slightly from €12 to €15 for the total recipe. But seeing as we're getting 10 servings, it's actually the same price per serving, but it's got a lower carbon footprint. So being 3.7 kilos in the last slide, it's now 3 kilos for this serving. So we're getting a more sustainable meal, and we're getting more fruit and veg into it. So we're getting about at least 2 of our 5 a day out of this recipe here, all in the one go, at a lower carbon footprint and for the same price. So that makes sense from both a health and a sustainability perspective. Then we can start maybe seeing, if we start to include beans in the recipe, what difference would this make? And very quickly, if we do maybe half mince, half beans, we'll reduce the serving footprint to 1.8. So we're going from 3 down to 1.8, and it's slightly cheaper at €1.27. If we replace all of the 750 grams of mince with the same amount of beans, we reduce our carbon footprint even further, and the cost of the meal for 10 servings somewhat more as well. But and we have the similar fruit and veg, because that hasn't changed, and there's a whole debate that we can maybe discuss another time on whether we consider the beans to be veg or protein. So that stays the same. If we look at the nutrient composition, and this is where we start to see that kind of difficulty between health and sustainability. We see when we go from the 8 portions to the 10 portions, our calories drop slightly because we're bringing in the fruit and veg. Our protein drops off a little bit because of the lower amount of meat that we've put in there. But our zinc, vitamin D, B12 is still quite good. When we bring in the beans, if we have the recipe that's entirely beans, so the 10 portion recipe with all of the meat replaced with beans, we now see our protein drops off significantly in this scenario. We also see our zinc drop off, our vitamin D drop off, which is already low in the population, and our vitamin B12 go down to 0. And then similarly, we see similar decreases if we've the 50-50 meat and beans, where the protein decreases somewhat, and some of the micronutrients decrease in the meal as well. So it's very hard to get that balance right. You need to be aware of what trade-offs you're making, if you like, when you go from one meal to the next, depending on whether it's plant-based or animal-based. The other important aspect to absolutely mention here is these diets aren't suitable for everybody. And one of the other areas that I do some research in is healthy aging and food consumption and food patterns in the healthy older population and prevention of sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass. And protein for anybody over 65, or even to start thinking about it, as early as our 40s. Protein is really important to maintain the muscle that we have, the strength and integrity of the muscle that we have. Because if our protein goes down, we actually start to lose our muscle mass. So it's really important to maintain a good level of protein. And the protein that's in red meat is much more digestible and has a better profile of amino acids than the protein we get from plant-based foods. Zinc and B12 are two other really essential nutrients for the older consumer as well. So it's just to be aware of, if you make those changes to more plant-based, you do need to be cognizant and consider, where am I going to replace some of those micronutrients from? So I just am ready to finish up with some final comments here, and it's consider the consequences of your well-intentioned changes. So as I said earlier, I like to cook in the kitchen, and some days, sorry, that's just coming out. Some days I might attempt the flexitarian or even the plant-based meal. And when I did, this was the consequence of it. So one of my daughters could methodically pick out every one of the chickpeas out of the bolognese. She ate most of the veg, so I did well on that bit, but the chickpeas essentially went. But luckily, I've Molly, the collie, who happily consumed the plant-based meal. And then just again, in terms of the well-intentioned changes, this sounds brilliant. We're proud of our science centre. It's 100% paperless, and everybody's cheering. And yes, that's brilliant, great success, until you go to the bathroom. So on that, I leave it for questions. I have included, actually, just before I go to that, I want to mention the Suhi Guide project. This is a Department of Agriculture funded project that I'm working on at the moment. I'm coordinating with UCD, UCC and Queen's. And we have put people on 2 different diets. We've just finished this intervention study where one group of people have been put on a diet where they're following the healthy eating guidelines. And the other group of people have been put on a diet where they have a much lower carbon footprint and a lot of the animal protein taken out of their diet. So they have about a 1.5 to 2 kilo lower carbon footprint diet than the healthy eating guidelines. And we're literally just finished the intervention study. Everybody has gone through this diet for 12 weeks, and we're now going to start looking at, are there different health indicators between those following a healthy diet versus those following a very low carbon, very low animal protein diet. And we'll, for the first time ever, we'll have some of these in vivo studies, if you like, looking at absolute biomedical measures of what the consequences are of a healthy diet, and can we get the same benefits from a lower carbon footprint diet. So it'll be much more, by this time next year, we'll have very solid evidence to see what direction our diets should take. And if the presentation is shared afterwards, there are some quick reads of the research here, and then the actual published literature that goes with the research is in the slides as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinead. That's fascinating. While you were doing that, and my guilty conscience got me to just set up a poll, which is something I don't think we've done before on the webinar. So I asked people, are you meeting the guidelines in the pyramid? And self-declared, so I don't know how accurate that's likely to be, but 40% say they are and 60% say they're not. That's probably typical enough, is it?
It's probably fairly reflective, and I think even sometimes like Christmas Day we won't be meeting the guidelines in the food pyramid. So I think you have to look at it over a period of time. Some days we're very good at achieving it, and some people achieve it all of the time. And I suppose the important point to make there as well, Pat, is that we don't always eat for health. A lot of the time as consumers, we're driven by taste. So if a food doesn't taste nice, we're not going to eat it, regardless of whatever health benefit or health claim that we make. And about 60% of the population eat for taste and not for health. So it would probably pretty much the 40% who said they do meet it are probably those health-orientated, health-driven consumers that we want more people to be like.
And the 60% of us are the ones who are cringing when you were going through that.
I my fingers crossed for myself the whole way through the presentation.
One of the surprising things that you mentioned, and I suppose I would have thought that the younger people would have had the more healthy diet, but that's not something you're finding. And is that a worry, or is that something that changes as people progress through the years?
Yeah, we do see that. And now, I suppose, first of all, what I should say is that those people who were in that younger 18 to 35 category of the data I presented there are probably now in the 40 category today. So that data is more than 10 years old, but the patterns don't shift that much within the population. It's mixed on that younger demographic. Some are very healthy and follow, maybe more likely to follow the flexitarian type of diet. But it's still at best, recent Board BIA data, at most there's about 20% of people following a flexitarian diet, and then that value decreases. And it is more prevalent in the younger population, but not maybe as prevalent as we think it might be. But you're correct in terms of, I suppose, as we age, the risks of a poor diet become more evident to us. So we're more likely to try and preserve the health that we have and turn things around and eat more healthily or reduce alcohol consumption as well. So there's always been, we see it across a lot of population data where you do see as you get older, the diet tends to get healthier.
Okay.
So
just
Pat,
a question.
Yeah, a lot of questions coming in. So you want to ask one first, Pat? Yeah.
Yeah, no, just one thing to clarify, and you mentioned the variability, and I suppose it's something I would have seen, the variability in the carbon footprint that's quoted for red meats. And I suppose there's two challenges for you as a researcher, that you have international standards and you have then, I mean, the Irish red meat is effectively coming in with a 20 kilo footprint, whereas internationally that tends to be quite a bit higher. And the question then arises, what is appropriate to use in the studies, particularly when there's that big of a gap between what's quoted?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why it's always really important. Where we use the McCann-Widison for nutrient analysis, and nobody would query your data when you're saying you're using that McCann-Widison. There is no equivalent in Ireland or anywhere else of that book for carbon footprint or any of the metrics for environmental impact of food. And as you know, Pat, way better than I do, the different farming practices will impact that. So if you do an analysis in one country, it can be very different based in comparison to another country. And you can't go to the one reference for all of your values. You have to select lots of different references. So I think that the take-home messages there is not that the 35 I use is perfect or in the middle or absolutely right, and it is the animal protein that we see that variation on. It's when you look at the different databases, the plant-based foods like your fruit and veg are similar enough. Yeah. But it's the animal protein where we see the big variation. And just even to point out as well, coffee, depending on what database you use, coffee can be worse than red meat in some databases, it'll give a higher value, because if they're taking into account the changes of land use and deforestation, that really drives up that conversion factor of coffee. And then the other piece, to just emphasize again, is the discretionary food. So while the individual carbon footprint of each of the foods isn't very high, when we combine all of those foods together and see what we're getting from it in total, because we're eating so much of them, the carbon footprint coming from those foods collectively has a huge impact as well, but tends to be forgotten about in this debate.
Seamus, as you say, plenty of questions coming in. So if you want
I might start from the top there, Pat. So, Sinead, given our ability to grow fruit and veg in this country, if we were to move to a high proportion of fruit and veg, how might this affect our carbon footprint? Or would the Irish diet be extremely bland in winter when a lot of local fruits aren't available?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and it's a huge question. Ideally, you would like to be able to provide the domestic supply of fruit and veg, and that what we would eat would be coming from local growers. And there's putting on, say, a very carbon footprint hat, flying it in from America or Africa doesn't have all that much of a carbon footprint impact relative to growing it locally. So that's one piece. But yet the kind of your intuitive head says it makes sense to get the one that's been grown locally over the road or anywhere in Ireland, really, given our small island, is relatively local. We have put in for funding, myself and some other colleagues have applied for funding within Teagasc to look at that very question. So could we meet that deficit in the diet with domestically produced fruit and veg? And if we were to meet it, what would the impact be? Are we going to have like bland months in the winter where you can't meet demand? Are people happy to give up strawberries with their Christmas dinner when it's not in season, if you like? So could we revert back to that in season and locally produced foods, and maybe look at kind of more traditional methods that would have been used some time ago to get through that leaner winter period, especially like going back to the fermenting and preservation methods that some of our parents might have used when there was less food being imported in that regard. But kind of, I suppose it's kind of turning that ship around, and it'll also be looking at, can we provide foods that can be grown here as alternatives to foods we're importing? So say the avocado trend took off so much in the last number of years, but they're coming in mostly from the United States. Some of the squashes and pumpkins can be a good replacement for avocado. So could we, and they can be grown here. So trying to identify what alternatives could be grown here as a replacement. And maybe if we get funding for this project, you might invite me back to share the findings to that question. But it hopefully could be somewhat possible even to fill some of that gap with domestically grown produce.
Yeah, and I suppose there's another question there very similar there as well. Is there a need for policy at national level to stop importing foodstuffs we can obtain in Ireland, such as animal protein and certain fruit and veg? So including the fruit and veg, more important where it really comes from?
It is, I suppose, the primary reason to stop importing would be to support national growers. But it's that age-old question coming up to an election. Do you want to stop your electorate from maybe eating avocados or kiwis? You know, if they're a big kiwi consumer, they mightn't vote for you if you put in policy to ban kiwis, let's say. You know, so it's just, I suppose it's that the policy piece isn't necessarily my area of expertise. But there's certainly a role for policy to try and encourage, because one of the recommendations is local and seasonal food as a sustainability measure. And I suppose that sustainability measure has that economic piece in terms of supporting the domestic market.
I think Pat go next there.
Yeah, so, you discussed legumes. Is there a combination of legumes and grains ideal for absorption in the body, or what's the I suppose the optimal in that space?
I don't really know the answer to that question that was asked. Optimally, it's a balance of all of the foods, and there's certain combinations in which we can eat food that can help absorption of foods. So having tea with your meal isn't necessarily very good, because the phytic acid in tea can slow down absorption of certain nutrients, whereas having orange juice with your meal can help absorb iron, especially the vitamin C in a juice helps. I suppose they get co-absorbed at the same time, and one helps the other. So there's a balance in that respect in terms of getting nutrients absorbed into the bloodstream. In terms of legumes and cereals, it's about keeping within the guidelines of what to eat.
There's a question there about the white meats as opposed to the red meats, and where do they fit in? Are they a replacement? You talked about some of the kind of the essential nutrients that come from red meats. Are they in white meats as well, or is there, I suppose, a mix of both kind of required in the healthy diet space?
Yeah. So when we go into the white meat piece, especially chicken, pork, turkeys that we'll be eating in a couple of weeks' time, its carbon footprint is much, much lower. We see about the chicken, I think I might have had it in that little scale. Our chicken is around 7 kilos of carbon per kilo of meat. So from a carbon footprint perspective, it is much, much lower. But the zinc is the one that's mainly in red meat. And the iron is higher in red meat as well. And we absorb it very well from red meat too. So it's just, if you do make any significant changes and entirely eliminate a food type or an entire food group. So if you were deciding, think I'll be more sustainable, I'll eliminate red meat, replace it with white meat entirely. You have to be conscious of what nutrients you're now eliminating as well, and where you will get that alternative source of these nutrients. So it's just, and if that's an entire food group, then there's probably even more nutrients that you need to think about.
Okay. There's a question there in relation to, I suppose, behavioral piece, and that's a lot of where I think you're coming to the table with your research on. And I suppose the specific question is asking about, do the food processors or the food retailers have a potential role in influencing our behavior around food? And I suppose we could broaden that question out. What are the key things? Like we can provide people with information, but that doesn't necessarily achieve changes in behavior. And what can we do, or what should we be trying to do to achieve that change in behavior for those of us who are in the 60%?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, whoever asked that. And again, like the discretionary foods, the retailer piece is forgotten in all of these debates, because ultimately, as a consumer, you're going into the retailer, and whatever is on the shelf in the supermarket on that particular day determines what you're buying, whether you're like bringing in that whole domestically grown or imported foods. Your choice is limited to what you see in front of you. So we were imagining scenarios, like if you could imagine going into the supermarket and thinking about eating the rainbow of fruit and veg, that if you have this lovely rainbow arc you go through as you start off, if the supermarket was laid out, let's say like the food pyramid, so you start with a really big section that's like a rainbow, lovely music, don't forget to get 7 of me, make sure you have at least 5. Do you know, if we could be driven, if you like, or guided around the supermarket, don't take too much here, only 1 or 2 treats per person in the family per week, something like that. I think definitely, whereas the retailers are not laid out in that way, if you like. And there's the buy one get one free, the sweets at the checkout, and those foods were meant to limit are put there in front of you. And there was, like, say for example, and that's like, that environmental piece is huge. There was one day I was when I was on my healthy drive, I was going from Dublin to Cork for a meeting, and stopped at one of the filling station places at Apple Greens or whatever they are on the way down. I had to actively seek out, where was there a fruit bowl that I could get a banana or an apple. I wasn't looking for anything exotic, and I had to go through an entire snake of sweets before I found this very sad, lonely looking fruit bowl with some very brown bananas and apples with a lot of brown spots on them as well. So that piece isn't put up front in front of us. It's like, it's nearly, if you imagine turning the pyramid upside down, it's the stuff at the top we're presented with first. So it's making, it's retailers have a huge part to play in making that I suppose the healthy choice and the sustainable choice the more easy choice for consumers as well.
Just conscious time. I got two questions.
Sorry, go ahead,
Sinead. Yeah. So if we replace the red meat and dairy, if we were to replace red meat and dairy and replace it with plant-based food that's imported from all around the world, how will that affect our carbon footprint? And the second part of the next question was, if we reduce the red meat and a healthy diet, could we save more than 1.6 kgs of CO2? I take it as.
Yeah, if we entirely take it, well, the scenario that I'll answer the second question first, maybe Seamus. That scenario where I took out entirely the red meat, based on the current dietary patterns that were at that time for those 1,500 adults, with red meat alone, we'd only save probably about 1.6 kilos, because within the meat shelf we also have the chicken and pork and other meats. So with red meat alone, that's about all we would save. That's taking into account the extra carbon you're going to generate eating the legumes. So it's not it's not you're taking 35 kilos of carbon out of it. You're also putting in whatever kilos associated with producing the alternative food. The second question was, if we removed all animal protein, so all dairy, all
so if you go to the red meat and dairy and replace it with plant-based food that's imported from around the world, how will that affect the carbon footprint?
I would be more. It would probably, if you were to do the calculation on the back of an envelope, you're probably going to get a lower carbon footprint. But not there. There's two things to start there. If I present you with a glass of cola and I present you with a glass of milk, they both have exactly the same carbon footprint. So here's a plant-based product, if you like, that if you were to ask me which one is more nutritious and complete, the milk will win hands down. So if I now change to a plant-based drink, and I'll that's not going into the oat drinks and almond drinks and so on as well. So there's that consideration to make. You're not necessarily replacing it with a better food. With some of the almond drinks, it has to be fortified with calcium. It has to be fortified with vitamin D. So we're losing out on some of the essential nutrients that we do get in dairy. So that's another loss. The other aspect as well is dairy foods are a really, really complex food. We don't even fully understand them yet. So there are other bioactive compounds within milk that's really good for us as well, that interacts with other foods. So you don't know what the impact would be if we were to remove that entirely. So I think if you do the calculation, yes, you probably get a lower carbon footprint, but I doubt you'd have a healthier diet. And again, that piece, if you make that huge change and remove an entire food group, there will be nutrient considerations you have to make. And now we need to produce more supplements to make sure that we're getting the vitamins and nutrients.
So we have to look at it in the round, and Sinead, really, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Do you want to go again, Pat? Just conscious time.
Yeah, no, we're pretty much out of time. I think one of the comments that's coming through is an appreciation from a lot of people about the balance in the discussion that's there, and I suppose we generally see in the news an awful lot of very much polar. And it's nice to get that balance, and I think people appreciate it. So thank you very much for that. In terms of other questions, I suppose there's one, I suppose maybe which is a good one to finish on. Do you see that there will be changes in the recommended or in recommendations for diet in Ireland in the near future? Is there anything coming down the line, or are we pretty good with our pyramid that's there?
We're pretty good with our pyramid that's there. There's as individuals, we haven't evolved to have different requirements. So our requirements are essentially still the same. The pyramid works. It probably, if I was to be critical of it, the point I would make is that the food pyramid is based on health and communicated on the basis of health. So if you were a food company trying to promote this idea of a food pyramid, you wouldn't promote it on health, Pat, because you want to make a profit. You want your product to succeed. I would be promoting it on taste. And I think you can really sell the fact that the convenience, the taste of an apple, let's say, can sometimes far exceed that of the treat shelf on the top. So it's not always about health. It's eat this and you'll have a tasty diet. And it's kind of more the health piece being more subtle. By the way, you might be a little bit healthier if you do it as well.
And maybe there's one comment, Pat, there's one comment there, maybe to finish on, Pat. I think someone put in there that he was reminded by someone who told him when the supermarket shopping, always stick to the outside aisles. That's where the good stuff is and the nutritious stuff.
And one of the best bits as well, I suppose, there's so much more to this whole piece of research that you can't cover in a short webinar. The food waste piece as well. If we go to the shops with a shopping list and only buy what you need, that's a good thing too. But those outer aisles is a good recommendation as well.
Yeah. And I'm reminded in terms of behaviour. I remember visiting our equivalent advisory services in Denmark. But on the way in, there was a fruit cart, and everybody was encouraged to take a free piece of fruit as the start to the day. And I just thought it was something really good to get good habits going.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming in and talking to us. And
thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Just next week, we're going to be joined by Anne Goggin and her, some colleagues, Tom Drennan and Philip Murphy, talking about the Waters of Life project, which is looking at our high status waters and looking at measures to try and improve the status of those high status waters. So looking forward to that. So until next week, I'd say thank you to Mary in the background. Thanks to Sinead and Seamus, and look forward to seeing you next week.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.